Hello, I wanted to remake my older videos on the history of negation in Japanese. This is because I'd made one or two mistakes in that video, and also left out a few other forms of negation found in older Japanese. So, now that I understand the topic better myself, I'd like to create a more accurate and far more concise, newer version. It's useful to understand the history of Japanese negation, as when learning Japanese there seems to be quite a diverse set of negations. For example, there is zu, nu, nai, zaru, and so forth. We will explore then how the Japanese language developed such a wide variety of negations and where they etymologically came from. So, I'd like to begin my explanation by expressing a difficulty I had in understanding negation in older forms of Japanese. I could not for the life of me figure out whether the negation nu or the negation zu came first in Japanese. This was important as, to the best of my knowledge, all forms of Japanese negation descend from nu and zu. It would therefore be really helpful to have a concrete understanding of how nu and zu existed alongside one another. The problem is that when you look up the etymology of zu or nu, you get a real chicken and egg situation. Online information will tell you that nu was the rentai-kei form of zu, so you think to yourself, okay, then nu must surely come from zu, but not so fast. You are then told that zu came from the renyo-kei form of negation in Old Japanese, which was ni. This ni was then combined with an older verb which meant to do, which was zu. How can nu come from zu, but then zu come from a form of nu? You are stuck with this sort of broken timeline where you go around in an infinite circle of trying to figure out which one came first. Luckily though, after scrolling up and down through Frelesvig's book, A History of the Japanese Language, I finally struck gold. This table beautifully lays out the chronological history. On the far left, under the letter A, we have the oldest forms of negation in Japanese, nu, ne, ni, and so on. This is also corroborated by Haruo Shirane, another expert on Old Japanese. Now, under letter B, we see some of the sound changes and combinations. So we see zu came from the rentai-kei form ni, plus the verb su, meaning to do. Then, under the letter C, we can see how initially forms like ni were lost as Japanese transitioned from Old Japanese to early Middle Japanese. This is fantastic then. We've resolved our infinite time loop, Inception-esque problem. We now know from Frelesvig that negation made via n sounds, such as nu, ne, and ni, came first, and later came zu. However, the only problem is that zu was used in the Nara period alongside nu. The Nara period, which was the early 8th century, is really the source of our first written Japanese sources. The incredibly important Manyoshu was written in the Nara period. Frelesvig gives us a line from the Manyoshu that uses zu. So I'm still a bit confused. It seems like zu and nu were effectively contemporaries. My only thought is that the nu, ne, and ni sounds were around before the Nara period in an even older form of Japanese, and were quickly placed alongside zu early on in the Nara period. I have no authority for that last point, and it's pure speculation. If anyone knows any more, I'd be very interested to know. But before moving on, I'd like to just give an example sentence for the negative form ni, as it is no longer used in modern Japanese. Yukue o shirani toneri wa madobu. Okay, if I bring up the previous table, we've covered the n/nu sounds, and zu. But what about zaru? You've probably seen zaru in set phrases such as saru o enai, which means I have to. Saru was born out of zari, which itself was born out of zu plus ari. Ari is the verb which meant to be. This happens a lot in Japanese etymological history. One word or particle is placed next to ari, which created a new word. Zaru was the rentai-kei form, the attributive form. For example, 思いつつ寝ればや人の見えつらむ夢と知らせば覚めざれましよ. Okay, to move on to our last but most contentious negation is nu and nai. I'd think that since nai is such a common word in modern Japanese, its etymological origin would be well understood and defined. But no, it's rather complex, so let's dig into it. Shirane gives us a seemingly quite straightforward explanation. He states that zu began to be replaced by nu in the Muromachi period, which began in the 14th century. What supposedly happened was that nu had been used only in the rentai-kei form, but now in the Muromachi period began to be used in the shushikei form. The rentai-kei form is the attributive form. For example, shiranu hito means someone I don't know. That nu modifies the hito. But what happened was that nu began to be used, as I said, in the shushikei form. If you look at the shushikei form, the kanji are end, stop, form. It's basically the form a word takes at the end of a sentence. So rather than saying shiranu hito, you could say kono yona mansoku na koto wa gozoranu. Gozoranu is the verb gozaimasu, modified with nu placed at the end this time. Shirane goes on to state that in the west of Japan, nu turned into an n sound, but in the east of Japan it turned into nai, giving us our modern nai. This is also corroborated by Feathersfig. So, in the west of Japan, suru, in its negative form, would become zenu, or zen. This is where the sen in masen comes from. Specifically, let's take the sen in tabemasen. It's from that sound change. This sen sound has now morphed into a hen, as proposed by Feathersfig. Let's take yomahen, which means to not read. It derived from yomiwasen. Eventually, a sound shift occurred in which yomiwasen just became yomahen. The sound change into n can still be heard in places like Osaka, where negations like ikan instead of ikanai can still be heard. Then, quite quickly, Shirane states that in the east of Japan, this nu supposedly became a nai, which is where we get constructions such as shinai from. However, this seems like a simplification, or at least a not fully nuanced explanation of all the possible theories. So, here are the three theories I managed to find on the etymology of nai, and I will run through the evidence for and against each. To note though, all the sources state that nai only began to replace zu in the Edo period, so this development from zu to nai is actually quite recent. So, the first theory I could find was nafu. There was a negative auxiliary verb that existed in Eastern Old Japanese, which was nafu. It would attach to the mizen-kei form, the form Japanese verbs go into before being attached to nai. I struggled to find any more information on nafu in either Shirane or Feathersfig's books. Furthermore, searching the term in Japanese online comes up with only surface level information really. However, the most damning evidence I found against nafu, being the origin of nai, is that nafu conjugated as a verb, whereas modern nai effectively conjugates as an adjective. If anyone knows any more about nafu though than the surface level information I could find online, it'd be very interesting to hear. Another theory is that nai came from nashi. What happened over medieval Japanese is that the rentai-kei form and the shushikei form began to be used interchangeably. That is why earlier, as I mentioned, nu began to be used at the end of sentences, rather than just being used as an attributive. So, what potentially happened is that we had nashi as an adjective. It was then being used in its rentai-kei form, naki, increasingly. Another sound shift occurred though, in which the rentai-kei form of Japanese adjectives shifted from a ki sound to an e sound. So, takai was originally takaki. Therefore, naki turned into nai, naki, nai. The issue with this theory, though, is that the negative tense in the Edo period conjugated differently to our modern nai. If you see the table presented on screen, look at the far left column. The past tense of nu was nanda, so rather than modern nakata, we would have said nanda. So the past tense of kaku, to write, wasn't kakanakata, it was kakananda. There therefore seems to be discrepancy here. Our modern nai works like an e-adjective, which is why nai becomes nakatta in the past tense. However, this Edo period conjugation is not the same, it's different. So it begs the question, is this a different thing entirely, or is the modern nai somehow still related to this Nanda origin? Then the final theory was the one Shirane presented to us, in which the nu that had replaced zu is the origin point. In the east of Japan, nu became nai, and in the west of Japan, it remained as nu and n. I am no linguist, so there is probably a level of complexity that I am missing. However, this is how I understood the arguments. Ultimately though, nai derives from an n sound, and if we remember back to the beginning, the first negatives in Japanese all had n sounds, like na, ni, ne, and nu. I can't tell you definitively where nai came from with great specificity, and it seems that Japanese linguists can't agree on that either. But whatever nai is, it is definitely related to those first n and nu negative sounds of Japanese. It must have come from them somehow, and it has to be related to them, but the path from old Japanese negatives to modern Japanese negatives and how we got nai isn't entirely clear, or at least there's no simple linear explanation. When you see the following negative forms in Japanese, nu, nai, zu, zaru, they should hopefully not seem too alien now, as they are all from the same origin point. You had a set of n and nu sounds that indicated negation in very old Japanese. From this, zu was born, which was a combination of the rentai k form of nu plus the verb to do, zu. Saru then was born from zu being placed alongside ari, the verb meaning to assist. Whilst nu, zu, and zaru might all sound quite different, we understand now that they are all just one family, however functional or dysfunctional they may be. Well, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate this is a topic I covered before. However, I feel like I did the topic a great deal more justice than I did before. My explanations are hopefully a bit clearer and more nuanced than in my first attempt at explaining the history of negations in Japanese. I'm going to eventually unlist the first video, as I feel like it's no longer up to a standard I'm happy with.